debunk, demystify, deconstruct the essentialist discourse that they talked about for Orientalists and people that fall under this category. But in the Middle East, and even with the revolutions in Tunisia, Egypt, Syria, Libya, and Syria now, there's a certain type of regime that survived this maybe fourth wave of democracy or democratization. And here I'm talking about the monarchic, I would say exceptionalism, because many scholars, pundits, often love to describe the Middle East as with the word exceptionalism. And here I think it's monarchic exceptionalism rather than Middle Eastern exceptionalism, because we've witnessed some changes that we can't really overlook. The reason for the persistence of autocracy in the Middle East bounds, and they can fall under different categories. The first one is the, as my colleagues referred to, though briefly, is the culturalist approach. And here maybe the epitome of the scholarly or pseudo-scholarly writing in this thing, I would say, is The Arab Mind, is a seminal work that was published in 1973 by Raphael Bataille, in which he designed a kind of a psychological profile for the Arabs and the Arab culture, in which it is irrational, primitive, violent, and for our purpose here is undemocratic. Much of the literature on the Middle East has fallen under this kind of, I would say, discourse. And irrationality remains the hallmark of the Arab cultural life, and this is incompatible with democracy. This is probably the conclusion of the Orientalists or essentialists. I mean, if I just want to widen the scope of those people, I would say even the not only the Orientalists but also the essentialists, to use the word of Fukuyama. I can also refer to Erich Duri in his book about Oriental despotism, as well as Bernard Lewis in his seminal book on Wowen Trump, in which he was trying to make a distinction or trying to compare and contrast between the West, the Catholic West or the Protestant West, and the Orient, that is the Islamic Orient, in which he said he came to the conclusion that the world of Islam has become poor, weak, and ignorant, and this is somehow true. Huntington also built on this literature in his Clash of Ignorance instead of Clash of Civilization, and I love to use the word the Clash of Ignorance because it was based on nothing. And I will say why. It's not only that I just want to attack him, but also I will come up with my own counter-argument against the Clash of Civilization when it comes to projecting the world as nothing but a struggle between the West, the democratic West, and the rest, or the undemocratic West. So Huntington was incorrect on three fundamental grounds. The first one is on empirical ground. It's enough for any one of us to have a look at what Ingelhout has written, Mark Tesler, and see that what he said about the incompatibility claim, or the incompatibility between the Islamic values, or those who believe in Islam as religion and those who believe in democracy. If you look at this, you will find that Huntington was completely incorrect. And secondly, he used the word culture in a certain way that also falls under the Orientalist debate, Orientalist discourse, which you said the Orient as opposed to the Occident or to the West. And the third point is that there's a lot of omission in his categorization of the dynamics that lead to democratization. It's not only the religion, it's not only also the Arab culture, or a culture in a way, although culture plays a role, but you cannot really use it as the only independent variable that can account for a certain outcome. Even before Orientalists, even if we go back in history, go to Karl Marx in 1848 when he talked about the Asiatic mode of production and Asiatic despotism. So this is rooted in the Western mind that the Arabs or Islam is incompatible with democracy. But I really want to add to this, because I don't believe in this kind of discourse and literature. Zaid just mentioned rentier economy or rentierism, and I think also it accounts for the lack of democracy in some part of the Middle East, particularly in the Gulf region. Some people also use the colonial legacy as all the national liberation movement that came during the decolonization period became autocratic. And here I want to also inject some argument advanced by Malcolm Carter in his book, The Arab Cold War, in which he said the Arab would have invented Israel. So it was very convenient for Arab leaders to invent Israel, or to say that no voice is above the voice of the battlefield, etc. It's simply to justify repression and prevent the shift from autocracy to democracy in different Arab societies. So it is not only the culture, and though I don't believe that the culture is the main or is the reason for that, but also you can talk about different approaches and paradigms. And this brings me to what I wanted to say at the very beginning. The Arab Spring, this new phenomena, and this led a lot of people to think genuinely that we are on the brink of it. We are on the brink of becoming finally a democratic societies in this part of the world. But I can see this happening right now. With due respect of the revolution in Tunisia and Libya, in Egypt, in Yemen, and then Syria now is even getting worse. You can't really talk about a transition into a democratic nature at all. So it is one thing when you believe in democracy, another thing when you believe in democracy as a vehicle to take over power in order to become an autocratic. And we've seen this before. We have seen this bad, silly, stale movie in 1930s with the fascist and the Nazist regimes. They were both elected by their own people, only to turn against democracy. And you know the rest is history, and I'm sure that you're aware of it. So the Arab Spring was not fueled by the diffusion of new ideas about democracy. So we know that when people talk to the street in order to topple regimes, they don't see eye to eye on what would or should happen next. Until today, if you see the debate in Egypt, for instance, on the constitution, it's a disaster. It's a lack of vision. It's a complete lack of vision on the part of the protesters and those who wanted to bring about change in Egypt. And the second thing I noticed, and I'm sure that everyone else, that there is no democratic legacy in this part of the world, and this probably has informed the ill behavior of certain political actors, especially the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. And also, we cannot see the external world as supportive to the transition from autocracy into democracy. And even when the United States responded positively, it was only reactive. You've seen this, they were hesitant in Libya and Egypt. At the very beginning, they were very hesitant, but then they just want to kind of jump in the wagon, or bandwagon, as they say, as some theorists of IR would argue. Also, we noticed in this part of the world that the Saudi Arabia have sought to limit the spread of democracy, and they paid money in that. We've seen them paying a lot of money for the Salafists in the Gulf, but also interfering militarily in Bahrain in order to preempt any probably revolution, because they were afraid of a sectarian component of that revolution. But also we know that the Saudis would never tolerate kind of democratic regime on their borders, because this would pose a question that this regime in Saudi Arabia would not be able to respond to. And another obstacle that still make the Arab Spring, that even the word lost its attraction now, I would even prefer the word Arab awakening, is the role of the United States in this. And we know that the short-term interest of the United States is the one that put stability on the front burner and democracy on the back burner. And this is very true because we've seen them coming to Jordan, for instance, we just had election, and I think elections somehow were not tracked, and not only were not tracked, actually 60% of eligible Jordanians boycotted the election because they did not believe in the process. And we've seen the American ambassador in Amman, the British ambassador, all the Western hailing and praising elections in Jordan as the best thing happened in the Middle East, and this is not true. So we've seen the West as supporting the autocratic nature of some Arab regimes, including my country. So this short-term interest of the United States in advancing stability over democracy has been one of the impediments that have complicated the Arab Spring. The other thing is the long-term interest of America, which is democracy, because we remember when the Bush administration came in 2000, and then shortly after that we had 9/11. Then all these neocons came up with the idea of promoting democracy as a way of salvation, because America would be better off with a democratized Middle East. And that's when they pushed for democracy, and I mean, thanks to them. I mean, I love this idea because it really exposed some regimes in the Middle East. But we know that immediately after the war in Iraq in 2003, the Americans had a rethink of their strategy, a rethink of their policy vis-a-vis this part of the world. Okay, I will try to finish before. Yeah, okay, fine. All right. Now, what I want to say here is that there are a lot of changes in the Middle East. I don't want to be seen as pessimist, but there is a certain type of regime that survived this wave of democratization. That is the monarchic or monarchists, I would say. And there are two explanations for that. One is cultural, one is institutional. The cultural explanation says that they managed to these regimes managed to have a kind of, or convince people of historical, religious kind of legitimacy, and it works. Now, you know, the King of Jordan says that he belongs to the house of the Prophet, and this may be enough for some people just to give in, or not even to think of any alternative. Some other people talk about the period of the dynasty in a certain Arab country, and this also helps convince people not to think out of the box or of another alternative. The institutional one talks about the fact that they managed to remain, these kings and emirs, princes, they managed to remain above politics. They're not really part in the coalition, part in the balance of power within a certain society, but they are above everything else, and they only, I would say, step in order to rectify things when things got off track. So these approaches, the cultural, institutional, can explain this kind of, I would say, persistence of autocracy with this type of regime. But also, we can't really ignore what my colleague said, the rentier economy, rentier theory. Those also monarchies were aided by rent, that is oil, in the role of the state in Saudi Arabia, in Qatar, in Bahrain, in Kuwait, in United Arab Emirates is not to produce but to redistribute the wealth. And the people are really not part of extracting this strength that is not under the sovereignty of people, but is completely owned by the small, corrupted, autocratic regimes and ruling elites in these countries. And also these regimes are really afraid of having any democratic model in their borders. One of the things that can justify why Saudi Arabia is supporting Jordan, because they just want to convince the king not to democratize enough, at least enough. Here, the role of, I say, the rent is very important in that, but also these regimes usually enjoy the support of the West. You name them by one. You will not find a single one of them that is not supported by the West. Jordan, Mubarak, no, sorry, I'm talking about monarchy. The six Gulf states, they're all supported by the United States. So the West has been supporting a kind of autocracy, and that's why maybe there are a lot of anti-American sentiment in this part of the world. It's not only because they support Israel, not only because they invaded, occupied Iraq, but also because they stood by regime against the ambition and aspirations of the masses. So the foreign patrons is also very important to take into account in understanding the persistence of autocracy with this kind of regime. So in conclusion, I would say probably instead of talking about the Middle East exceptionalism, I would say monarchic exceptionalism is a better word to depict reality in the Middle East, and here I conclude, and thank you very much.
So we have 35 minutes, so lots of time for a few rounds of questions. Let's start with the first package. James?
Yes, thank you very much for those three delightful. Thank you very much for those three very delightful presentations. I just have a general comment, not a real question, but maybe you want to go and comment on this yourself later on. There has been a lot of bashing of Orientalism, Arab Spring bashing, Saudi bashing, Western bashing, and while I would agree to a certain extent with some of them, I don't want to comment on any of those. But there's one thing that has been coming up again and again, and this is Middle East studies bashing. Why did we not predict the Arab Spring? And I find this almost, I mean, from a social scientist point of view, almost ridiculous or obscene, this question. Because we, in the social sciences, we don't do causality. I mean, we don't prove causality. We can't. There's no way for us to do this. This is really the political scientists with their statistics, you know, it's a little bit fun to see what they do, but they don't, I mean, causality is not something that they ever do. Examine. This is why we have psychologists for them do experiments. We don't do experiments in the social sciences. What we do is, ever since Max Weber, we understand, you know, understanding sociology. We try to understand the things that we see. And it's very good that we don't predict, because we will be just the useful tools of politicians to go and do certain things, to do something that happens somewhere else. We will be and scholars in the social sciences, for anyone who's serious in their job, I think causality is not something we do. We explain, we understand, we try to get structures, and we try to talk about them. So I just want to say this obsession with causality that now two of my colleagues were talking about. And I want to very strongly criticize this, because I think this is not what we do. And what we did up until 2011, we were explaining the persistence of authoritarianism. And guess what? Authoritarianism persisted. Now, this is what we explained. This is what we tried to understand. Not more, not less. We did a good job, I think, doing this. So this Middle East studies bashing is, in my opinion, I mean, I see this everywhere. And I absolutely disagree with this, because we don't predict the future. We just don't do this. We never did, and we will never do. Thank you.
Thank you, James. For whom?
My predecessor, I want to actually encourage both Dr. Said and Dr. Berthold for their attempts to find causal relations, because I think this is what we actually should do. But at the same time, there's something like, I mean, there was a lot of consensus, and I want to try to crack it a bit. I think there's one disagreement between you. Dr. Said made a strong point against essentialist theories, and I think for good reasons. Because, I mean, many of these essentialist theories, I mean, they were really, to say the least, challenged by what happened in the Arab Spring. I mean, like all those who claimed before that somehow Islam prevents people from demanding democratization or so, they were somehow proven wrong. And I mean, maybe I'm not fair here now to Dr. Berger, but I would like to challenge you because in a way, I mean, your list of factors that we should check in terms of transition, they were referring to these essentialist theories in a way. I mean, you said, for example, let's say we have to have a look at some cultural factors, maybe preventing this transition to become a transition to democracy. But wouldn't you agree, or I mean, I would say that aren't there good reasons, going with Dr. Said, that many of these theories that you now want to use for analyzing the transition period, haven't they been proven wrong, I mean, to make it very strong, by the Arab Spring itself? So why should we now artificially save them? Wouldn't it be more advisable to search for more structural theories that are, let's say, free of culture to analyze the transitional period? Thanks.